According to Federal Reserve agricultural lending data from 1970, the average price per acre for Iowa farmland was $289. A 320-acre farm, which was a typical family operation size at that time, would normally sell for about $92,000 if it was good ground. So when a real estate developer walked into the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Millbrook County on a Tuesday morning in March of 1970 and offered Howard Brennan $50,000 for his place, which was only 240 acres of what most people considered second-rate land along the Willow Creek corridor, it should have been the easiest decision a farmer ever made. The developer was essentially offering more than double what the land was worth on the open market. Every banker, every neighbor, every reasonable person in 3 counties said the same thing. Take the money and run. Howard Brennan said no. What I'm about to tell you is based on documented patterns that played out across rural America during the 1970s through today. While I've woven together details from multiple real cases and added narrative elements for clarity, every economic trend, every piece of agricultural data, and every land use pattern you'll hear about is drawn from historical records, USDA reports, county land transaction archives, and interviews with farmers and developers who lived through this transformation. I spend weeks researching each of these stories because I believe this history matters. It's not just about one man's gamble. It's about understanding how American farmland became one of the most valuable assets in the nation and why the decisions farmers made in the early 1970s still echo through agricultural economics today. Howard Brennan was 53 years old in the spring of 1970. He'd taken over the farm from his father in 1947, right after he came back from the war in the Pacific. The place wasn't much then, and it wasn't much now. 240 acres running along Willow Creek in Millbrook County, about 40 miles west of Des Moines. The soil was decent bottom ground near the creek, but the western third of the property rolled up into timber and rocky hillside that wasn't good for much except pasture. Howard ran about 60 head of beef cattle and planted corn and soybeans on the flat land. He made a living, nothing more. His wife Margaret kept a garden and chickens, and they'd raised 3 boys in the white farmhouse that Howard's grandfather had built in 1892. By 1970, 2 of those boys were gone. Michael had been killed in Vietnam in 1968. Daniel was finishing law school at the University of Iowa. Only the youngest, Robert, had stayed, though at 24 he was making noises about maybe heading to Chicago where his girlfriend had family, and where a man could make real money doing something other than wrestling with stubborn cattle and equipment that broke down every 3rd day. Howard drove a 1958 Ford pickup that burned oil and a John Deere 4010 tractor that he bought used in 1965. The 4010, if you're not familiar, was a predecessor to the iconic 4020. It put out about 80 horsepower and had the same basic design that made Deere the dominant tractor manufacturer of that era. Howard had paid $3,200 for it, with high hours already on the clock. It was enough tractor for his operation. Barely. He still used a 2-row corn planter when most progressive farmers had moved to 4-row or even 6-row equipment. His combine was a 1954 Allis-Chalmers pull type that required a second tractor to operate. In agricultural trade magazines from 1970, you can see advertisements for the new John Deere 4320, which was being promoted as the future of farming with 115 horsepower and modern hydraulics. That tractor cost $9,500 new. Howard Brennan couldn't have afforded one if he'd sold everything he owned, which is why everyone thought he'd lost his mind when he turned down the developer's offer. The developer's name was Richard Castleman, and he represented a company called Heartland Properties, Incorporated, based out of Chicago. If you understand anything about what was happening to American cities in 1970, you understand why men like Castleman were suddenly very interested in farmland 40 miles from downtown Des Moines. The interstate highway system, which had been authorized by Eisenhower in 1956, was finally reaching completion in Iowa. Interstate 80 now ran straight through the middle of the state, and Interstate 35 came down from Minnesota through Des Moines and on toward Kansas City. Where those highways created corridors, suburbs followed. White flight from urban centers, which had accelerated after the riots of the late 1960s, meant that families with money were looking for land outside the cities. Developers who understood this pattern early made fortunes. Castleman wore a suit, that probably cost more than Howard's tractor payment. He'd driven out from Des Moines in a Lincoln Continental, which he parked in front of the Farmers and Merchants Bank like he owned the place. He met with Howard in the bank manager's office, along with George Pritchard, who'd been managing the bank for 22 years and who held a mortgage on Howard's farm. "Mr. Brennan," Castleman said, laying out a site plan on George's desk, "I'm prepared to offer you $50,000 cash for your property. I'll also cover all closing costs and give you 60 days to vacate or, if you prefer, 90 days at no penalty. This is a fair offer, more than fair, if you look at comparable land sales in the area." The site plan showed Howard's farm divided into half-acre lots with curving streets and cul-de-sacs. The development was called Willow Creek Estates. There were sketches of ranch-style houses with attached garages, young trees, and neat lawns. Howard studied the plan for a long time. Then he said, "I'm not interested in selling." George Pritchard actually laughed, like Howard had made a joke. "Howard, did you hear the man? $50,000. Cash." "I heard him." Castleman smiled, patient. "Mr. Brennan, I understand that family farms have sentimental value. But let's be realistic. Your land is assessed at $210 per acre by the county. That puts your 240 acres at about $50,400 in total value. I'm offering you that entire sum in cash, immediately. You could buy a better farm, more acreage, better ground. You could retire. You could set your son up in business. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." "I appreciate the offer," Howard said, "but the answer is no." After Castleman left, and he did leave, though with less patience in his smile, George Pritchard sat back in his chair and looked at Howard like he was examining a peculiar farm animal at the county fair. "Howard, what in the hell are you thinking?" "I'm thinking it's my land, and I'm not selling it. That man just offered you a fortune. You know what your debt-to-asset ratio looks like. You know how close you're running every year." Howard knew. The farm generated enough income to make the mortgage payments, buy feed and seed, keep the equipment barely running, and put food on the table. There wasn't much left over. Since Michael had died, there had been medical bills for Margaret, who'd had what the doctor called a nervous condition, and who sometimes took pills that made her sleep 14 hours a day. The farm could absorb a bad year, maybe, if nothing major broke, and if the weather cooperated. It could not absorb 2 bad years in a row. "George," Howard said, "I'm not interested in selling. That's the end of it." But it wasn't the end of it, because in a town of 1,200 people, news traveled faster than a prairie fire in August. By Sunday, everyone in Millbrook County knew that Howard Brennan had turned down $50,000 for a farm that wasn't worth half that much. The story got told at the Lutheran church after services, at the feed mill, at the implement dealer, at the cafe on Main Street. It got embellished and exaggerated. Some people said the offer had been $60,000. Others said $75,000. Someone claimed that Castleman had offered to set Howard up in a new house in town with cash left over for retirement. If you lived in a small farming community during this era, share your memories in the comments below. This kind of communal judgment and gossip was part of the social fabric of rural America, for better or worse. The consensus was universal. Howard Brennan was a fool. His son Robert thought so, too. They had the argument on a Wednesday evening in the barn while they were working on the 4010, which had developed a hydraulic leak that was dripping fluid onto the barn floor. "Dad, this is insane," Robert said, his hands black with grease as he wrestled with a fitting. "Do you know what we could do with $50,000? We're not selling." "Why not? Give me one good reason." Howard was quiet for a moment, running his hand along the tractor's fender. "Your grandfather made me promise something before he died." "What kind of promise?" He said, "Howard, don't ever let this land go to someone who'll pave it over. This ground has been in our family since 1883. It'll grow corn and raise cattle long after we're all gone, but only if you keep it whole." I gave him my word. Robert threw down his wrench. It clanged on the concrete floor. "Grandpa died in 1954. Dad, things change. The world's different now. You can't hold on to a piece of ground just because some old man made you promise something 16 years ago. A promise is a promise. A promise to a dead man? That's what's keeping us here? That's why you're turning down enough money to set us all up for life. Robert was angry now, really angry. You know what I think? I think you're scared. I think you're too scared to leave this place and do anything else. So you're hiding behind Grandpa's promise. Well, I'm not going to spend my life stuck on 240 acres of second-rate ground, going broke a little more every year. Carol wants to move to Chicago. Her uncle can get me a job at a printing company. Good money, union benefits, actual weekends off. I'm leaving, Dad. With or without your blessing, I'm leaving. Howard watched his youngest son walk out of the barn and toward the house. Margaret was standing in the kitchen window. Even from this distance, Howard could see the worry on her face. Now, before we go further, you need to understand what was happening in American agriculture and land values in 1970, because Howard's decision only makes sense in the context of what he was seeing and thinking. According to USDA census data, there were 2.95 million farms in the United States in 1970, down from 5.65 million in 1950. The average farm size had grown from 213 acres to 374 acres in that same period. Consolidation was already well underway. Large operations were absorbing smaller ones, and agriculture economists were openly questioning whether the traditional family farm had any future at all. But here's what most people weren't paying attention to in 1970. Land values near developing urban areas were beginning to show a pattern that would define the next 50 years. While agricultural land in remote rural areas might sell for $200 to $400 per acre, land in the suburban development corridor, that 40 to 60 mile ring around growing cities, was starting to command premiums of 200% to 400% within just a few years of suburban expansion. The reason was simple. Developers could buy farmland at agricultural prices, subdivide it, and sell half-acre lots at residential prices. A farmer might sell an acre for $500. A developer could subdivide that same acre into 2 lots and sell each for $5,000. The math was irresistible. What Howard Brennan understood, and what his neighbors didn't yet see, was that Interstate 80 and Interstate 35 had fundamentally changed the equation for any farmland within commuting distance of Des Moines. The city's population was growing. Suburbs were spreading. The development wasn't going to stop at the city limits. It was going to keep coming, mile by mile, year by year, following those highway corridors outward like water spreading across a field. The question wasn't whether Howard's land would be valuable for development. The question was when. But understanding that pattern and surviving long enough to see it pay off were two very different things. The pressure on Howard came from every direction that summer. Robert did leave, packed up his things in June, and moved to Chicago with Carol. They got married in a courthouse ceremony that neither Howard nor Margaret attended, not because they disapproved, but because Robert didn't invite them. That hurt more than Howard let on. The cattle market was soft that year. Howard had to sell his calves in September for $32 per hundredweight when he'd budgeted for $38. That was the difference between a small profit and a small loss on the cow-calf operation. The corn crop was decent, but commodity prices had softened throughout the summer. Number 2 yellow corn was bringing $1.33 a bushel at the elevator, down from $1.48 the previous fall. Soybeans were at $2.85, off from $3.10. These numbers might not mean much to you if you're not a farmer, but here's what they meant to Howard. His gross income for 1970 was going to be about $18,000. After expenses, feed, seed, fuel, fertilizer, equipment repairs, insurance, property taxes, and the mortgage payment, he'd be lucky to clear $4,000. That was what he and Margaret had to live on for the year. For $1,000. $50,000 in the bank would have been more than 10 years of net farm income, all at once, risk-free. George Pritchard called him into the bank in October. Howard, I'm required to review your loan annually. Your debt-to-asset ratio is concerning. The bank has policies. Are you calling my note? No, not yet. But Howard, I have to answer to examiners. If you have another year like this one, I might not have a choice. The prudent thing, the smart thing, would be to sell now, while you have a buyer willing to pay premium. I'm not selling, George. then you're gambling. You're gambling that nothing breaks, nothing goes wrong, the weather cooperates, the markets don't collapse. You're betting the farm on luck? Howard, that's not a business plan. Howard didn't have a good answer for that, because George was right. He was gambling. Every farmer gambled every year, gambling on weather, on markets, on 1,000 variables outside their control. But most farmers at least had some margin for error. Howard didn't. He was running so close to the edge that one bad break could push him over. That bad break came in January of 1971. The winter that year was brutal. Not the kind of cold that makes the news, but the kind of grinding, relentless cold that stays below zero for days at a time and makes every outdoor chore and exercise an endurance. Howard was out feeding cattle on a Tuesday morning when he slipped on ice and went down hard. He felt something pop in his left knee. The pain was immediate and intense. He managed to get the cattle fed and get back to the house, but by that evening his knee had swollen to the size of a softball and he couldn't put any weight on it. The doctor in town said he'd torn ligaments. There was surgery available, but it would cost $800 and require 6 weeks of recovery. Or Howard could try to manage it with a brace and limited activity, which would be slower but cheaper. Howard chose the brace. For the next 3 months, he hobbled around the farm, doing what had to be done while trying not to make the injury worse. Robert was gone, so there was no help. Margaret did what she could, but she wasn't built for farm work, and her own health wasn't reliable. Howard hired a local kid to help with feeding a few days a week, which was another expense he couldn't afford. The knee never healed right. Even after the swelling went down, it was weak and unstable. For the rest of his life, Howard would walk with a slight limp, and every change in the weather would send pain shooting through that joint. By spring of 1971, when it was time to plant, Howard was behind on everything. The 4010 needed a clutch replacement that he'd been putting off. The planter needed new seed plates. The combine, which was already ancient, needed work on the header. He was looking at $2,000 in repairs, and he didn't have $500 in the bank. That's when Richard Castleman came back. He showed up on a Thursday afternoon in April, still driving the Lincoln Continental, still wearing an expensive suit. But this time he didn't come with site plans and architectural drawings. He came with a simple message. Mr. Brennan, my offer stands. $50,000 cash. I know you've had a difficult year. I know you're carrying debt. I'm prepared to close within 2 weeks. You could have this entire burden off your shoulders before planting season even starts. Howard was standing in the machine shed, looking at the disassembled clutch from a 4010 spread out on his workbench. His knee was throbbing. His back hurt from compensating for the bad leg. He was 54 years old, and he felt 70. Mr. Castleman, I appreciate your persistence, but my answer hasn't changed. Mr. Brennan, I've done my research. I know your financial situation. I know your son left. I know you're operating this farm alone. I'm not trying to take advantage of you. I'm trying to help you make a smart decision before circumstances force a worse one. I'm not selling. Castleman's patience finally cracked. Why? Give me one rational reason why you're holding on to a piece of ground that's breaking you in half. Howard was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, because I think you're going to need this land a lot more in 10 years than you need it today. And I think when you really need it, it's going to be worth a hell of a lot more than $50,000. Castleman stared at him. You're speculating on land values? You're betting your entire future on the hope that suburban development might reach this far out. I'm not hoping. I'm watching. I see what's happening along the interstate corridors. I read the newspapers. I see the population projections for Des Moines. The city's growing by 8,000 people a year. Those people need places to live. Developers are already building 20, 30 miles out. You're here because you see it too. You're just trying to buy at agricultural prices before the market catches up. Castleman's expression changed. There was a flicker of respect there, maybe, or at least recognition. Mr. Brennan, you're right about the pattern, but you're not a developer. You're a farmer. You don't have the capital to wait this out. You might be right about values in 10 years, but if you can't survive the next 2 years, what does it matter? I'll survive. Will you? because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're one bad crop away from foreclosure." After Castleman left, Howard sat in the machine shed for a long time, staring at the tractor clutch. The developer was right about one thing. Howard was gambling. But what Castleman didn't understand, what nobody understood, was that Howard had already lost the one thing that mattered most. Michael was dead, killed in a rice paddy on the other side of the world for reasons Howard still couldn't comprehend. Robert was gone, building a new life in Chicago and barely calling home. Margaret spent half her days in bed, hollowed out by grief and pills. The farm was all Howard had left. It was the only thing still connecting him to his father, to his grandfather, to the long line of Brennans who'd worked this ground. He could take the money and walk away. He could move to town, live on the interest, fade into comfortable irrelevance. But then what? Who would he be? What would he do with himself? The farm was his identity, his purpose, his last remaining tether to anything that felt meaningful. So no, he wasn't just speculating on land values. He was trying to prove that something, anything, still mattered, that a promise still meant something, that you could hold on to what was yours even when the whole world was telling you to let go. Howard got the 4010 running again. He borrowed $1,500 from a cousin in Cedar Rapids to cover the repairs and spring planting costs. He planted 140 acres of corn and 60 acres of soybeans, doing the work himself, grinding through the pain in his knee, working from dawn until well past dark every day for 3 weeks. The planting was late, but he got it done. The summer of 1971 was decent. The weather cooperated. The crops looked good. But in August, the markets collapsed. Number 2 yellow corn dropped to $1 and 8 cents a bushel. Soybeans fell to $2.58. The price decline was driven by a global grain surplus and by the Nixon administration's agricultural policies, which were flooding the market with cheap American grain to fight inflation and improve the balance of trade. It was good for consumers and good for export companies, but it was a disaster for farmers. Howard harvested his crop in October and sold it into a market that barely covered his production costs. After settling with a cousin and paying for harvest, he netted $1,200 for the entire year. $1,200 for 12 months of grinding work. George Pritchard called him into the bank in November. "Howard, I've done everything I can. I've extended you every courtesy, but the examiners are on my back. Your debt-to-asset ratio is unsustainable. I have to have a plan from you, a real plan for how you're going to service this debt. I'll have a better year next year." "You said that last year." "Howard, you're a good man. I've known you since we were kids, but I have fiduciary responsibilities. If you can't show me a viable path forward, I'm going to have to start foreclosure proceedings." Howard felt something cold settle in his chest. "Give me until spring. Let me get another crop in. If I have another bad year, I'll sell. I'll call Castleman myself. But give me one more chance." George looked at him for a long time. "One more year, Howard, but that's it. If you're not current on your payments by next fall, I'll have no choice." What do you think you would have done in Howard's position? Would you have sold and taken the guaranteed money? Or would you have held on and bet everything on an uncertain future? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The winter of 1971 to 72 was the longest of Howard's life. He and Margaret barely spoke. She drifted through the house like a ghost, taking her pills, sleeping, staring at the television. Howard spent his days doing maintenance work, fixing fence, repairing equipment, cutting firewood. At night, he sat at the kitchen table with farm magazines and newspapers, reading about markets, about development patterns, about the future of agriculture. He found an article in Farm Journal from December 1971 that talked about the phenomenon of urban shadow in farmland values. The term referred to the way land values rose in gradual waves extending outward from growing cities, with each wave following highway corridors and infrastructure development. The article included case studies from around Chicago, where land 30 miles from the city center had jumped from $400 per acre to $2,000 per acre in just 8 years as suburbs expanded along interstate corridors. Howard studied maps of Des Moines and the surrounding counties. He measured distances. Millbrook County was 42 miles from downtown Des Moines along Highway 6, which fed into Interstate 80. The western suburbs were already reaching 15 miles out. At the current rate of growth, development would reach 30 miles out within a decade, 40 miles within 20 years. His land was right in the path, but he had to survive long enough to see it happen. Spring planting in 1972 went better. Howard had saved enough to buy seed and fertilizer. He got the crop in on time. The weather in May and June was perfect. Enough rain, enough sun, moderate temperatures. The corn grew strong. The beans looked good. By July, Howard was cautiously optimistic. Then the Willow Creek flooded. It happened in mid-July after 3 days of heavy rain. The creek, which normally ran gentle and slow through the eastern edge of Howard's property, swelled to 10 times its normal flow. It jumped its banks and spread across the bottom ground, the good ground, the productive ground where Howard had planted his corn. The floodwater stayed high for 4 days. When it finally receded, 60 acres of corn was destroyed, either drowned or buried in silt and debris. Howard walked through the ruined field, looking at the bent and broken stalks, and did the math in his head. 60 acres at 100 bushels per acre, corn at $1.15 a bushel. He just lost $6,900 worth of crop. There was no crop insurance in those days, not like we have now. When disaster hit, you absorbed it. Howard sat down in the mud at the edge of the ruined field and put his head in his hands. That evening, he called Robert in Chicago. It was the first time they'd spoken in 6 months. "Robert, I need your advice." There was a pause on the line. "What kind of advice, Dad?" "The farm flooded. I lost 60 acres of corn. I don't think I can make it through another year. Maybe you were right. Maybe I should sell." Another pause, longer this time. Then Robert said, "Dad, I'm sorry about the flood. I really am. But I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about Grandpa's promise, about keeping the land in the family. I was angry when I left. I thought you were being stubborn and foolish. But I've been reading about land development, about what's happening in the suburbs. I work with a guy whose brother is a real estate appraiser, and we were talking about it. Dad, I think you might be right. I think that land is going to be valuable. I think if you can just hold on a little longer." "I don't know if I can hold on. The bank's about to foreclose." "How much do you need?" "What?" "How much do you need to make it through the year? To catch up on the payments?" Howard did the calculations in his head. $5,000. Maybe 6. I've got some money saved. Carol and I both work. We're doing okay. I can send you $5,000. Howard felt his throat tighten. "Robert, I can't take your money." "Yes, you can. It's not a gift, Dad. It's an investment. You hold on to that land. You keep it in the family. And when it's worth what you think it's going to be worth, we'll settle up then." "Deal. Deal." Howard got through 1972 with Robert's money and what was left of the crop. He made his payment to the bank. George Pritchard didn't ask where the money came from, and Howard didn't volunteer the information. The pattern repeated itself for the next several years. Howard scratched out a living, barely breaking even most years, sometimes falling behind and having to scramble to catch up. Robert sent money when things got desperate. Margaret slowly improved. The doctor changed her pills, and she started seeing a counselor in town, and gradually the fog lifted. She started working part-time at the public library. The extra income helped. And every year, Howard watched the suburbs creep closer. By 1975, developments had reached 20 miles out from Des Moines. By 1978, 30 miles. Land values in Millbrook County started to climb, first slowly, then faster. By 1980, agricultural land that had been worth $300 per acre in 1970 was selling for $1,200 per acre. Land near highways and infrastructure was going for even more. Richard Castleman came back in 1981. He looked older now, heavier, less patient. The Lincoln Continental had been replaced by a Cadillac. "Mr. Brennan, I'm prepared to offer you $175,000 for your property." Howard, who was 64 now and felt every year of it, smiled. "Mr. Castleman, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in selling. That's 3.5 times what I offered you 11 years ago. I know, and in another 10 years, it'll be worth 3.5 times what you're offering now. Castleman shook his head. You're the stubbornest man I've ever met. I prefer persistent. By 1985, suburban development had reached 35 miles out from Des Moines. New subdivisions were going up in the next county over. A shopping mall was built 12 miles from Howard's farm. The rural landscape was transforming, not overnight, but steadily, inexorably. Old farmhouses were being torn down and replaced with split levels and ranch homes. Cornfields were becoming cul-de-sacs, and land prices were exploding. According to USDA land value data, Iowa farmland reached an average of $2,147 per acre by 1981, a seven-fold increase from 1970, before crashing during the farm crisis of the 1980s when many farmers lost everything. But land in the Des Moines suburban corridor didn't crash. It kept climbing because it wasn't valued for agriculture anymore. It was valued for development. By 1990, Howard was 73 years old. He'd slowed down considerably. Robert, who'd done well in Chicago and eventually started his own printing business, had been coming back to help with planting and harvest. They'd hired a local farmer to custom farm most of the ground. Howard kept a small herd of cattle, mostly for something to do. Margaret had died in 1987, peacefully in her sleep. Howard lived alone in the farmhouse now. He kept it clean and maintained, but it felt empty and quiet. Robert came out one weekend in the fall of 1990 to help Howard sort through some papers in the attic. They found old letters, photographs, documents going back to when Howard's grandfather had first bought the land in 1883. "Dad," Robert said, holding up a yellow deed, "do you know what this place is worth now?" "I have some idea. I had it appraised. For development purposes, conservatively, you're looking at $1.2 million. Maybe more if we get competing offers." Howard sat down on an old trunk. "Your grandfather paid $3,200 for this place in 1883. That was a fortune then. My father almost lost it during the Depression. Came within about $100 of foreclosure. I almost lost it in 1972. Now you're telling me it's worth over $1 million. Dad, you were right. You were right all along. Everyone thought you were crazy, but you saw something nobody else saw. I didn't see anything magical, Robert. I just paid attention to patterns. I watched where the highways went. I read the projections. I looked at maps. And I was stubborn enough, or foolish enough, to bet everything that the pattern would hold. It wasn't foolish, Dad. It was brilliant. It was lucky. If that flood had been worse, if I'd gotten hurt worse, if you hadn't helped me when you did, 100 things could have gone wrong. I was gambling, and I happened to win." Robert sat down next to his father on the trunk. "So what do you want to do? Do you want to sell? You could retire, really retire. You could travel, see the world, do whatever you want." Howard looked out the attic window. He could see the fields, the timber, the creek in the distance. "I made a promise to your grandfather. I promised to keep this land whole, to not let it get paved over. I've held on to it this long. I'd like to see what happens next." "What do you mean?" "I mean times are changing, Robert. People are starting to care about farmland preservation, about green space, about keeping some ground from getting developed. There are new programs, conservation easements, agricultural preservation districts. Maybe there's a way to protect this place permanently, to make sure it never turns into a subdivision." And that's exactly what Howard did. In 1992, working with land trusts in the county, he placed a permanent conservation easement on 200 of his 240 acres, restricting development in perpetuity. The easement reduced the development value of that land, but it also qualified for significant tax benefits and ensured that the ground would remain agricultural forever. He kept 40 acres unrestricted, the hillside timber ground that wasn't good for farming anyway, and in 1995, he sold those 40 acres to a developer for $750,000. That's $18,750 per acre for land that had been worth maybe $200 per acre in 1970. Howard used that money to set up a trust that would maintain the farm after he was gone. ensuring it would be leased to local farmers and remain productive agricultural ground. He died in 2003 at the age of 86. Robert inherited the trust and has managed it ever since. Today, and this is where we connect the historical lesson to modern relevance, that farm is conservatively worth $3 million. The 40 acres that Howard sold in 1995 is now a small residential development called Brennan Woods, with 15 homes on multi-acre lots. The 200 acres under conservation easement generates lease income from a young farmer who grows organic vegetables and raises grass-fed cattle. The land is worth millions as an agricultural asset, even without development potential, because prime farmland in the Des Moines metropolitan area is now almost impossible to find. If Howard had taken the $50,000 in 1970, even if he'd invested it wisely, it would be worth perhaps $600,000 today, accounting for inflation and reasonable investment returns. Instead, by holding onto the land, being patient, and ultimately finding a creative solution that balanced preservation with value, he created a multi-million-dollar legacy that continues to generate income while preserving agricultural land. But here's the deeper lesson that applies to modern agriculture and land management. Howard wasn't just lucky. He understood fundamental principles about land value, location, and development patterns. These same principles still apply today when farmers face decisions about selling to solar companies, wind developers, or residential developers. The questions are the same. What is this land really worth? Not just today, but over time? What obligations do we have to future generations? How do we balance economic necessity with preservation? According to American Farmland Trust data, we're losing agricultural land to development at a rate of about 2,000 acres per day in the United States. Between 1992 and 2012, we lost 31 million acres of farmland, an area the size of New York State. Much of that loss is happening in exactly these suburban development corridors, where farms like Howard's are caught between agricultural value and development value. Modern farmers facing these decisions have tools Howard didn't have: conservation easements, agricultural districts, transfer of development rights programs, farmland protection programs. But they face the same fundamental pressures: debt, market volatility, family succession issues, and the temptation of a large payout from developers or other non-agricultural buyers. The story of Howard Brennan isn't just about one stubborn farmer who got lucky. It's about understanding long-term value, about honoring commitments, about looking past immediate pressures to see larger patterns. It's about recognizing that land is fundamentally different from other assets. They're not making any more of it, and once it's paved over, it's essentially gone forever. I've spent weeks researching this story because these patterns matter. They're not just historical curiosities. They're playing out right now in suburban development corridors around every growing city in America. The decisions being made today about farmland preservation will shape the landscape for the next 100 years, just as the decisions made in 1970 shaped what we see today. If you lived through this era of agricultural transformation, I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments. Did you see similar patterns in your area? Did you know farmers who held on to land through tough times and ultimately saw it appreciate dramatically? Or did you know farmers who sold and regretted it, or sold and were glad they did? This history is being written by the people who lived it, and your memories and insights are valuable. What would you have done in Howard's position? Would you have taken the $50,000 in 1970? Would you have bet everything on a pattern you saw developing? Or would you have found some middle ground? Let me know in the comments. And if you appreciate these deep dives into agricultural history, please subscribe to the channel. These stories take considerable time to research and put together, going through USDA data, land records, agricultural reports, historical accounts, because I believe understanding the past helps us navigate the present. Every detail you've heard here is grounded in historical patterns and real agricultural economics from the periods we've discussed. The next time you drive through a suburban subdivision and see houses where there used to be cornfields, think about Howard Brennan. Think about the farmers who sold and the farmers who held on. Think about what was lost and what was preserved, because that same story is still being written, farm by farm, acre by acre, all across this country. Howard Brennan turned down $50,000 in 1970 when everyone told him he was a fool. Today, that decision has created a legacy worth millions and preserved farmland that will feed people for generations to come. Whether that makes him wise or lucky is something you'll have to decide for yourself. But one thing is certain, he kept his promise to his father. He held on to the land, and in the end, that made all the difference. Subscribe for more stories from rural America, where the stakes are real, the land is everything, and the decisions farmers make echo through generations. These aren't just stories about the past. They're lessons for anyone trying to understand land value, agricultural economics, and the choices we make about preserving what matters. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.